Diamond is 14 and an 8th grader at West Prep Academy on the Upper West Side. It's her first day back at school since November, but she says it doesn't feel special.
On the regular first day of school, more people will come. It's mostly crowded, but now it's just fewer people and the energy feels low.
But Diamond's classmate, 13-year-old Rosie, is glad for the change of scenery. Even so, she has mixed feelings about returning to the school's social scene.
I don't know. It's like a lot of snakes in here.
Snakes is what Rosie says when people are being fake. You'll notice both of these students focused on the same thing. Not academics, not COVID-19, but how returning to school affects their social life. Ernestine Briggs-King is a professor at Duke University and the director of the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. She says in-person social interaction is vital for middle school students.
And that's such a critical part of their developmental trajectory. And so we want to think about how we meet their needs for, social emotional engagement with their peers and with their teachers and things of that nature.
But she says many of the students who need the structure and resources of school the most are staying home as the middle schools reopen. Out of almost 250,000 middle school students, only about 60,000 are expected to return. Briggs-King says students going back to school are disproportionately white and from more affluent districts.
The inequities that I think COVID has exposed and for many of our families exacerbated, that it's just not being in the school system means a lot more to children of color.
In neighborhoods hit particularly hard by the pandemic, parents are especially concerned their children could get sick or bring the virus home to vulnerable family members. To address those fears and to get the kids back to school, Fabienne Doucet, an urban education professor at NYU, says the Department of Education needs to communicate better with parents throughout the city.
Rather than having kind of like a generalized response that's going to be a one-size-fits-all, it's really about thinking more community-based. And then your role as the administrators is to ensure that equity is at the center of all those community responses.
Ernestine Briggs-King sees this as a moment of potential.
I think it's a great opportunity for schools to think about how they can reimagine what school looks like for kids and how they can reimagine how they address issues of mental health, trauma, and even racial equity.
She says in order to get more of New York City's vulnerable students back in school, the DOE must do more to listen to these families. Renee Roden, Columbia Radio News.
I think it's great. I will say that I think that we need a police response to some calls. And those are situations where there are concerns about dangerousness and or illegal behavior. But the majority of those calls, those mental health calls, are not about that. And they don't require a police presence. Simply put, a mental health crisis deserves a mental health response.
As we know so far, this program would involve people would call in and 2 EMTs and 1 social worker would arrive on the scene. In terms of your experience, would these measures of de-escalation strategies work?
Well, obviously, it's hard to know in advance. However, I will say that certainly having mental health clinicians, a social worker, certainly is, I think, the right approach. Sometimes, even before an officer has a chance to say or do anything, their mere presence can escalate a situation through no fault of the police officer. So if we think about replacing police officers with clinicians, I think that makes a whole lot of sense.
Your comment on police potentially escalating a situation is so timely given the recent announcement of grand jury choosing not to indict the Rochester Police Department after the homicide of Daniel Prude. Given that so many communities of color have a distrust of police when it comes to mental health emergencies, what can be done to make sure that communities of color use this service if it's available?
I think simply education around the service exists, that it's a non-police alternative to respond, to support, to help, to de-escalate, and refer individuals who are in crisis, I would hope wouldn't be met with much, if any, resistance at all.
You've personally led efforts to develop crisis intervention, both in your time as a police academy instructor and at various levels in New York State. Could you talk about efforts that could be taken to ensure that these de-escalation strategies are taught, whether to the current people that would be involved in this mental health pilot program or in the future for police if it was a situation where they were needed?
So there's a variety of different, I think, training approaches. Now, what we do in our police training, we have a lot of didactics around mental illness and ways to communicate and de-escalate. But more importantly than the didactics is the scenario training or the role playing that we do. It's one thing for people to be sitting in a class and listening and having some discussion. It's a little bit different when you take that kind of that newfound knowledge to sort of apply to skill-based scenarios. And so we do a lot of that when we get to training police officers.
Dawn Kamen, the director of the Institute for Police, Mental Health, and Community Calibration, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
At H Mart on Broadway and 110th, when customers check out, the cashier asks if they want a bag.
Need a bag. You want a single bag or double bag?
A single bag's fine. But no more plastic bags. Customers buy paper bags for 5 cents each, but many bring reusable bags. Alexis Goldsmith is the national organizing director of the environmental group Beyond Plastic. She said when the pandemic began, there were questions about the safety of reusing bags.
We didn't know whether coronavirus traveled on surfaces. We since have found reusables actually are safe, and coronavirus doesn't live as long on cloth as it does on plastic.
Also, before it went into effect, plastic bag manufacturers and bodega owners brought a lawsuit claiming the ban was unconstitutional and would burden small businesses. In August, the lawsuit was struck down and the ban was enforced in October. It's difficult to assess how effective it's been. According to the Freedom of Information Law request obtained by Beyond Plastic, the city has only issued 38 written warnings to stores for violation. Goldsmith says it may just take a while for stores to make the change.
There's stores that have thousands of plastic bags still that they need to get rid of. Just because the ban has been enacted doesn't mean that we can give up on getting plastic bags out of our state.
The bag ban also specifically excludes restaurants, which can still use single-use plastic bags, utensils, and condiments for takeout and delivery. There's been a big increase in the year of the pandemic. Michael Oshman is the founder of Great Restaurant Association. He says that restaurants should cut back on single-use plastic.
Many customers, they're getting this food delivered at their home. Well, guess what they have at their home? Reusable metal utensils.
A proposed amendment to add restaurants to the ban was introduced last month in state legislature. Dr. Stephen Cohen, environmental science and policy professor at Columbia University, says we may not see a lot of enforcement early on because the purpose of the ban is really to raise awareness.
In New York City, people's attitude toward garbage is casual. So you have to build a kind of cultural support for these kinds of things, and getting people aware of the bags they're carrying things in is one part of that process.
State legislators are taking additional steps to counter the rise of plastic waste. One proposed bill passes the expense of collecting and recycling plastic back to the manufacturers. Haley Zhao, Columbia Radio News.
My job was to scrub tanks, get them ready for the new shipments of fish to come in. We'd have to pack fish, catch them, count them, bag them.
Retired aquarium keeper Dave Lund recalls his first job tending fish when he was in high school.
Sunday nights were the most special because that was when the fish from South America would come in. The electric eel came in and it was huge. The biggest net we had was maybe like a foot wide, maybe 9 inches deep, with a metal frame around it. Well, I was tasked with catch the electric eel, we have a buyer. Well, I got shocked. The boss caught the eel with the same net, only he had rubber gloves on.
You're listening to Uptown Radio from Columbia Radio News. Every Thursday at 5 p.m., wherever you get your podcasts.
Immigrants make up 1/3 of the state's essential workers, but many don't qualify for health care because of their status or income. The long game for advocates is to get medical coverage for all immigrants, but in the meantime, they're narrowing their scope, providing coverage for about 5,000 of them who are low income.
You know, do you have a roof over your head? Do you have food to eat? The last thing that you really should be worrying about is about access to healthcare during a pandemic.
That's Arlene Cruz. She's with Make the Road New York, an immigrant advocacy group. They're co-leading the campaign. She says there are some programs offering temporary coverage for a select few groups of immigrants. Minors under 19, people who are pregnant, DACA recipients. But the coverage is easy to lose. You can age out or earn more than low-income applicants are allowed to. It can make staying covered tough. And while, regardless of your immigration status, there are public hospitals and clinics you can go to.
However, it's not the same thing as having access to health insurance where you can choose your doctor, where you will experience a smaller waiting period to actually see your doctor or access specialists.
And Cruz says with temporary insurance, people would have coverage for medication, which isn't always available through public health systems. That's why she says she supports the new bill. It would cover New Yorkers who meet 3 criteria. First, their household incomes are 200% below the federal poverty line. Second, they've had a confirmed or suspected case of COVID-19. And lastly, they're excluded from other insurance because of their immigration status. Amanda Luggs is with the African Services Committee, a nonprofit advocating for African immigrants. She also wants the bill to pass, but she worries there's a misconception as to who foots the bill.
And just to underscore it, it wasn't or it never has been to give free health care. What it is the opportunity to buy the insurance coverage that you need.
That means immigrants would pay for the coverage themselves. And 2 months after the pandemic ends, so would their temporary insurance. The legislation was sponsored only by Democrats. In order to move the bill forward, it needs to pass through the Health Committee. 10 out of 15 members are Democrats. No itinerary has been set yet for the next committee meeting. Arcelia Martin, Columbia Radio News.
In January, the NYPD and the de Blasio administration adopted a new set of guidelines called the Disciplinary Matrix. The guidelines recommend penalties for officer misconduct that range from a loss in vacation days to termination. Last week, at a city council meeting, Councilmember Adrienne Adams said the NYPD's penalties aren't strong enough.
The current practice of simply docking vacation days when an officer's actions or inaction causes harm is a slap in the face to the victim, their families, and to their communities.
Last week, in response to the new NYPD guidelines and to Cuomo's executive order, the City Council introduced 12 bills covering a wide range of police operations. One bill would shift oversight of cases involving excessive use of force and offensive language from the police commissioner to the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Another is intended to protect suspects from unreasonable search and seizure. NYPD attorney Oleg Chernyavsky responded in last week's council hearing.
What you are doing in this bill, based on the way this bill is drafted, is penalizing police officers for acting lawfully and penalizing every other police officer at the scene for not intervening when their colleague is acting lawfully.
Alexander Reinert is a law professor at Yeshiva University. He says individual accountability is fundamental to policing.
The argument that it's punishing officers for doing their job is a strange one to me, that the officer's job is not to behave unconstitutionally. The officer's job is to protect and serve without violating the Constitution.
Police union representatives say the city council's policies would prevent officers from doing their jobs and negatively impact recruitment rates. Paul DiGiacomo is president of the Detectives Endowment Association. He says that NYPD's recently introduced disciplinary matrix could address Cuomo's mandate for change.
The matrix has been enacted, It's in there only a couple of weeks, and you didn't give it a chance yet to see if it works, which is unfair to the people of the city and also to the people within the police department.
At last week's council hearing, Mayor's Office Representative Chelsea Davis called the disciplinary matrix a living document that could still be updated if necessary. The City Council will continue considering their own reform bills to meet Cuomo's April 1st deadline. Katie Anastas, Columbia Radio News.
Last spring, as COVID-19 began to shut down New York, nasopharyngeal swabs, those Q-tip-like sticks that feel as if they touch your brain during a COVID test, became suddenly vital and scarce. Robert Halaluk is founder of Print Parts, a 3D printing company in Manhattan. He remembers watching coronavirus cases mount.
And the numbers were getting so staggeringly high, you didn't have time to spin up a normal manufacturing process.
Normal manufacturing might involve updating a factory, buying specialized equipment, sourcing new materials, or hiring and training workers. Aside from money, the process can require a lot of time.
If you're a big company, you're sitting there saying, okay, why am I going to invest all this money into this product that there might not be a need for in 6 months?
That's Cody Burke, COO of Print Parts. He says building out a production line for NP swabs could have cost traditional manufacturing companies hundreds of thousands of dollars. It also might have been risky.
By the time I'm up and running, this crisis might have passed. Other people might have done the same thing, or things might be coming in from China again.
Or Maine or Italy, where other traditional swab manufacturers are based. Enter 3D printing. With this method, Print Parts could make thousands of swabs in a matter of hours. No new factories, workers, or training required. Instead, the company would simply load a swab design onto one of their SLA printers.
In the industry, we sometimes just call them goo printers, because it's this sort of nasty, very sticky material.
In the case of NP swabs, that goo is medical-grade resin. The resin sits in a container at the bottom of the printer. The printer dips in, and using UV light, it hardens one micro-thin layer of resin at a time.
And then pull up and then repeat that process over and over again.
That repetitive layering is why 3D printing is also called additive manufacturing. The ease of this process allowed a team of doctors to source 160 designs and develop a new NP swab on an unprecedented timeline. Dr. Rami Arnaud is with Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He led the team.
We were able to go from identification of the problem to the first of 4 clinically validated 3D printed NP swabs in 22 days.
If that feels fast, that's because it is. And it meant companies like Print Parts could begin manufacturing the same day designs were validated. However, the process wasn't without challenges. Halaluk had to build a special contraption to cure, or dry, thousands of swabs a day. It looks like a gas station fridge, but filled with UV light tubes and racks of swabs.
We started to call it the disco oven because it's basically looks like you're in a big ultraviolet party at a club.
By the end of last year, Print Parts supplied over 1 million swabs for New York City's COVID tests. Dr. Arnaud says the collaboration and speed of the NP swab solution is exceptional, but he is unsure it will happen again without another crisis. Kate Stockram, Columbia Radio News.
When people think of Fifth Avenue, one word pops up: luxury. The street is home to multiple designer flagship stores, including Gucci's. The lease on a nearly 50,000 square foot space occupied by Gucci was supposed to expire in 2026. This week, parent company Kering Group announced it had renegotiated a new agreement at a discounted rate. Terms were not disclosed. Gucci's decision to remain in Trump Tower puts the company at odds with most other big fashion companies who have moved to distance themselves from the Trump brand. But not everyone thinks Gucci has made a bad move.
So I think that business decisions should always be based on data and facts and numbers.
Filmai Sardari is the director of NYU's Fashion and Luxury MBA program. She says Gucci's move makes good business sense.
And if Gucci has managed to negotiate a great lease, this is wonderful for them because they can start rebuilding the brand of Fifth Avenue as they increase their sales.
By staying in Trump Tower, Gucci will retain a prime flagship location for a reduced cost. Stephanie Takata is the CEO of the fashion design and consulting group Stateless. She says that the most important part of this deal are the bragging rights that come with a slice of Fifth Avenue real estate.
Most major retailers, or the major retailers that you see on Fifth Avenue, are there so that they have a flagship presence on Fifth Avenue. Those stores are so expensive. The rent tends to be so oppressive that those stores lose money, really. If you look at the stores, lose money on actually having those stores there. But in the name of brand equity and in having a presence, not only for New Yorkers, but for world tourists, those flagship stores are important to them. They kind of bring legitimacy to the brand.
Gucci's retention of a Fifth Avenue footprint may be good for its public profile, but it's hardly risk-free. Kylie Scales is the founder of Think Free Global Strategies. She says that by continuing its association with Trump, Gucci risks alienating customers and distancing itself from the fashion world at large.
I think if this situation is an indication, other brands will take pause in engaging with the Trump brand or any brand who represents or doesn't represent us moving forward as a society in our addressing racial inequity. I think that we've seen from this example that addressing racial inequality and thinking about how to dismantle systems that oppress different various intersectional groups in our world is something that consumers want to see more action and more activity towards dismantling those barriers.
While other brands are taking strong social stances, Gucci's decision reads as politically passive. For now, the Gucci Fifth Avenue flagship will remain in Trump Tower. Fei Liu, Columbia Radio News.
For over 100 years, my family ran a funeral home. So I learned growing up, when someone dies, there's a list of things that have to get done and a system for who does them. The stack of paperwork to fill out, the phone calls, the clothes you have to wear. And when an older family member died, I knew what time to show up and where to stand. There were fresh flowers and old photos, soft organ music and slow walks through the cemetery. Loved ones were all around, and after the funeral, we moved as a pack to a restaurant, feasting and toasting and reminiscing. Last spring, when COVID descended on New York, my husband and I abandoned our apartment and fled to Vermont. We quarantined in a house with no TV or internet and barely cell service. One morning, I was washing dishes under the frigid well water. We had been bickering about our dwindling savings. My husband sulked under the front window, the only spot in the house with phone reception. I heard him gasp. "Conan is dead," he said, straining to hear the voicemail. Conan was his best friend. He lived in New Orleans. He wasn't young, and he didn't take care of himself. He lived off cheap whiskey and whatever food he could buy, selling paintings outside the hot dog joint on Frenchman Street. We thought he could survive anything, even a pandemic. My husband once saw him eat a live palmetto bug right off the sidewalk. The call was from Conan's neighbor. He said he'd found my husband's number in a notebook after police left the scene. No one on the block had seen Conan in days, and when the cops finally beat down the door, they found him on the bed. My husband lowered his phone and walked out the back door. I stood at the window and watched him cross the yard. I wanted to run after him, but I was still angry. I tried to remember the funeral to-do list. I kept picking up plates, rewashing them, and wondering what we should do. We could buy plane tickets and be in New Orleans tomorrow. No, too much money. Plus, I didn't know if planes were safe with the virus. I could hear my husband tearing wood panels off the old shed he was restoring in the side yard. There would be no convocation, no rousing toasts to Conan's memory, no flowers. Just a lonely house on a mountain and the wind rustling the trees outside. We never found out exactly how Conan died. We heard later there was a socially distanced wake on someone's porch. Only a handful of people came. We don't even know where he's buried. Maybe someday we'll be able to travel down to New Orleans again. For now, we're still waiting to say goodbye to Conan, waiting to start checking the boxes off that list.